And so that's where I think it's happening in some of these people that adopt essentially zero carb diets. It's just that all that protein, which I think is a good thing, is stimulating glucagon to a higher amount than average, and thus they're seeing a higher glucose level in the blood. But again, though, I don't think that's a problem. Your comment about the hemoglobin A1c, how people will see that it's going up, that can be a result of two things. And I think it's the second I'll mention that too many people overlook, including in clinical practice. Yes, hemoglobin A1c can be a reflection of an elevated glucose. Yes, that's true. But there's another part of that formula, or another variable that's going into this formula. Hemoglobin A1c is glucose and hemoglobin, or the red blood cell itself. And too many people only look at the glucose part and totally ignore the hemoglobin or red blood cell part of it. Hemoglobin is just a part of red blood cells. So what I think can also be happening in this case, and there's some limited case reports in the published literature to confirm this, which is why I'm mentioning it at all. So it's partly a theory of mine and partly backed up by data. The more nourished a person is, especially with red meat and beef, I believe the longer the red blood cells live, that essentially the red blood cells are healthier and they last a lot longer. They can last up to, maybe 50% longer than someone who's, say, a vegan and who's eating very, very, nutrient deficient diets for the most part. And the longer a red blood cell is alive, just the more likely it is to get glycosylated or to have a glucose bind to it. And so what I think may be happening in these people with long-lived red blood cells is that they're kind of getting a false positive with their hemoglobin A1c test. So they get a hemoglobin A1c and it's in the mid fives, and the clinician will say, oh, wow, it looks like you're kind of getting pre-diabetic. When in reality, their glucose levels are in the 80s or maybe low 90s. Those are very, very good levels. Even I would say around 100. Those are fine glucose levels. It's just that they have really long-lived red blood cells. In contrast, you could have someone with elevated glucose levels and a normal hemoglobin A1c, and they would get a pat on the back. And it's just because they actually have really short-lived red blood cells. The red blood cells die so quickly that they never have time to get glycosylated, and thus they end up having a false negative. You think, you have this false sense of security that their glucose levels are actually okay, when in reality they're not great and they are trending in a wrong direction. It's just the HbA1c doesn't detect it, again, because it's a problem with the red blood cells in this case. I think as closely as we can, we should eat our omega-3s like nature intended. And I think it's pretty fascinating that in nature, when we eat omega-3 rich foods like fish, they're also rich with vitamin E and natural antioxidants. Yeah. And I think what's interesting to note is that with polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-6s and omega-3s, so they have three pathways available to them. One, they can be stored. We can store polyunsaturated fats in fat cells or in lipid droplets. So we can store them. Alternatively, they can go down the route of oxidation. In other words, we can burn them for energy. That's what I mean by oxidation. And then lastly, they can go down the route of peroxidation, which is the one that most people are afraid of, and rightly so. When we take an omega-6 or omega-3 fat and it goes down the peroxidation, that's when it's potentially problematic. If we burn it for energy, well, that's fine. It's just creating energy. And the fact is, Judy, those omega-6s and omega-3s are burned at a very, very high rate. In fact, we burn polyunsaturated fats so rapidly that they're the most ketogenic of all the fats, because we burn them so quickly that the liver and a few other cells, like some in the brain, just start putting it down into the pathway of making ketones because we're burning so much of them. So they have a very high oxidation or energy burning rate. Now, which sort of pathway predominates? I think it's really a matter of antioxidant presence, and that will prevent it from going down the peroxidation pathway to a degree. So I think if I agree wholeheartely, people should be absolutely eating fish. Anyone who is interested in that topic should look up the work by a man named Stephen Cunnane, Cunnane. He wrote a fascinating book called Survival of the Fattest. And he looks at human brain development and how humans are remarkable creatures because we are the only land-based mammals that are born obese. We have these big hungry brains and all this fat in our bodies that are capable of turning into ketones to fuel this explosive brain growth in this high metabolic rate organ. Stephen Cunnane very much embraces this idea that the human evolutionary diet is ocean shore based, that we were eating foods that were rich in omega-3s to support this incredible brain growth, and rich in iodine to make thyroid hormone to support rapid brain growth, because thyroid hormone is very, very involved in that.
Oysters is really, really balanced with the zinc and copper. And since they kind of counteract each other, it works beautifully. And then same thing with fish. So if you really want the fat soluble vitamins, fish has a very beautiful balance of A, D, E, and K. You know, people eat grass finished beef or lamb because they say, oh, it's richer in omega-3s, or they buy the egg version of omega-3s.
Yeah.
But it's nowhere near the amount of like 1 ounce of salmon roe, or 3 ounces or 4 ounces of just salmon or sardines with their bones intact. So that's where, you know, I'm in agreement with you. I think just eating a variety is ideal. People are scared, like, well, what about all the mercury? What about all the PFAs in the waters? And, you know, I had Dom Agostino on, and he said he wanted to test that. So for his N=1, he had like 6 cans of sardines every single day. And he tested his mercury, and it was nowhere near what people thought it would be. And there were people in his school or his community that have way more than him, and they don't even eat fish. You know, there's some people saying that ketogenic diets long-term are not ideal. Again, insulin will be too low. Without insulin stimulation, you may not have the thyroid hormone and metabolism functioning right.
There are so many myths surrounding the ketogenic diet. I would say anyone who is attempting to claim that long-term adherence is somehow going to be harmful, I would just say, show me the data. I don't know of any evidence. There are studies published showing people mentioning, these are kind of prospective studies, which means it's a little flawed, mentioning people adhering to ketogenic diets for up to 4 years and having total remission of type 2 diabetes throughout that entire time. And that's really the lens through which I see the ketogenic diet. Of course, its origins are in the treatment of seizures, for which it can be completely curative. We've also known for 100 years that ketogenic diets can completely resolve migraine headaches in most people. Now, this is anecdotal. I know people who've been doing this for years, for a decade, and all they have experienced is the benefits of good health. So I know of no evidence to suggest that it cannot be adhered to long-term. There's no evidence to suggest that the thyroid gland is in any way altered. There is some evidence to show that thyroid hormone production goes down, but I wonder at why people think that's a problem, because we know that insulin production goes down on a ketogenic diet. Leptin production goes down. These are all natural. Cortisol levels tend to drop over time. And to me, it is a function, not that the thyroid gland is damaged, it's just that the body has become more thyroid hormone sensitive. And so there's an improvement. So there's no evidence to suggest this is harmful in any way. In contrast, there's evidence to show that thyroid hormone is working better, that they're more sensitive to the thyroid hormone, just like they are to insulin. And as insulin levels come down because the body's becoming more sensitive to it, so too, it's analogous. Thyroid hormone comes down because the body's becoming more sensitive to it. I think if this is a person who has a cognitive deficit, that's a strong reason to follow a ketogenic diet. And among many other potential benefits, if this is a person who struggles with type 2 diabetes, then I believe that a ketogenic diet is going to be very, very helpful. But the majority of people nowadays are insulin resistant.
Right.
And so we know that if you're insulin resistant, a low carb diet will vastly outperform a low fat diet. Yeah, we know in men in particular, when men adopt low fat diets, their production of testosterone and their production and quality of sperm drops precipitously. I would imagine the same thing will go to a degree in women as well. Right. But I look with such wonder and a little sadness at how we went from being very fat obsessed. I thought we went a little too far and that we were too afraid of protein. Now we're swinging the other way. Now we're protein obsessed. And you see people who are exceptionally lean and they're advocating these very high protein diets. And in fact, I don't think it's healthy. We know that there's such a thing as nitrogen poisoning. And when you start to run out of body fat, then why on earth are you focusing on protein when that's what you're cutting? You're literally stripping your own protein at that point, because that's the difference between a fast and starvation. Have we run out of fat? And when we start to run out of fat, we start making less ketones. And now all the brain's energy needs must be met by the glucose that comes from stripping the amino acids from muscle through gluconeogenesis. So I think we've unfortunately started swinging too far the other way. And that as much as I'm an advocate of eating protein, and I absolutely am,
Right.
prioritizing protein is one of my key kind of dietary foci, but I think we still have to go back to eating them the way nature intended.
Yes.
Where all of the best proteins in nature come with fat. That's how we should eat them. We should, fish is a wonderful protein source and a lot of fat. Well, that's how we should eat it. Beef is supposed to come with fat. That's how we should eat it. One of the reasons I'm a little cool on eating chicken is that our ancestors didn't. Even within the United States in the last 100 years, you look at chicken consumption, and it went by being absolutely the lowest meat consumed by far. And now it is the single most common source of meat. Right. And beef and pork and the others are they're about where they were 100 years ago. And it's just chicken that has come up from nowhere to being the number one. And I'm not saying chicken's bad, but I grimace a little when I see that's become the main meat, where I think we don't have enough fat in it. Like, I know for my kids in my home, as they're growing, I want them to eat wonderful sources of protein, and I want them to have lots of fat. And so if we're ever cooking with chicken, I want to make sure there's butter all over that chicken, or that there's olive oil all over that chicken. I just want them to be eating a lot of fat with that protein, because that's how it's supposed to come, I believe, in nature. And we know that it's the most anabolic mix. Right. Fat and protein together will induce greater muscle growth than any amount of protein alone.
With this thought, so a lot of these people then are swinging to, well, I need a little bit more energy because protein alone is not giving me energy. So instead of saying, let me try some fat, they go, let me try some fruit. So now they're eating, moderate protein.
Or honey. I know, a lot of honey fans now, more and more.
Right. So, but I worry about that whole uric acid model with the fructose, with, this. And do you think there's any concerns with that?
Absolutely. There's no question. Uric acid is going to be in much higher production from fructose consumption and fructose metabolism than almost any amount of protein from meats. Like the purines from meats is such an incredibly modest, I would say irrelevant contributor. But every time we metabolize fructose, we are pushing things down that pathway of uric acid production. I actually stopped drinking a yerba mate drink that I had become really enamored with. One of the molecules that are in yerba mate and other teas like it are theobromines.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I looked up the source, and theobromines, I think, can produce 10,000 times more uric acid, even than fructose can. Because I was noticing a little bit of gout in a finger, and I noticed a little, what's called a gouty tophus on my ear, a teeny little bump on my ear. And I knew of these symptoms of gout, this pain in my knuckle on my finger, and it kind of changed in the shape of it at the end of it. And then this little bump on my ear. And I thought, I think I'm getting gout. And it was quite shocking to me. And so I started analyzing all of my behaviors, and I was drinking this yerba mate a lot, like almost throughout the day, more than I was drinking water at the time. Okay. And so I looked it up and realized that this theobromine, this chemical that's found in coffee and teas, although at lower levels than in yerba mate, 10,000 times more uric acid production capability than even fructose. And so I cut that out. Wow. And within a few months, my problems had resolved. Thyroid hormone will do all kinds of things throughout the whole body. Literally every cell of the body will have some response to thyroid hormone, except red blood cells, because they don't have nucleus. But the thyroid will tell every cell to do all kinds of things. At the muscle cells, it will induce mitochondrial biogenesis. It's one of its many, many variables. And that's kind of essential in a ketogenic state, because if you are in ketosis, your primary fuels at the moment are fats, and you can only burn fats in the mitochondria. And it's interesting to note that thyroid, which is the body appears to be more sensitive to thyroid hormone in a ketogenic state, it's basically facilitating the production of mitochondria to enable the body to burn the fats better, as it is in a higher fat burning state. Now, thyroid hormone actually does kind of similar things at fat cells, where thyroid hormone can induce the synthesis of mitochondria in fat cells as well, and increase the metabolic rate in the fat cells by activating this uncoupling of the mitochondria. So thyroid hormone does that at fat cells, but it doesn't do that at muscle cells. muscle cells, it just tells the muscles to make new mitochondria. And all of it may be with the purpose of just burning fat a little better. Levothyroxine, which is a medication for people with hypothyroidism, is the second most commonly prescribed drug in the entire United States.
I believe it.
That to me is mind-blowing. It is shocking to me. And to me, whenever I hear this kind of statistic, I think, well, it's not like we're evolving to lose our thyroid hormone, our thyroid gland. This is not a genetic phenomenon. This is an environmental effect. There are people who are inadvertently exposing themselves to a way of eating and the chemicals or the molecules in those foods that are potentially damaging their thyroid gland. It's just shocking. And of course, a lot of that would be autoimmune, like with Hashimoto's. And anytime you're talking about an autoimmune disease, females are always going to be almost always going to be more impacted than males because of the relevance of estrogen actually is kind of somewhat contributing to autoimmune diseases. But when you spike your insulin, you lower the overall energy availability in the blood. David Ludwig's group at Harvard published an incredible paper on this, looking at 2 meals that were equal in calories. And they looked at energy availability, which was a function of all the available kind of calorie nutrients in the blood after eating a meal. And they found that the higher carbohydrate meal, lower fat, had a much higher insulin release, not surprisingly. And insulin tells nutrients to go out of the blood and into the cells of the body. And so the overall availability of energy in the blood was significantly lower after an insulin spiking meal than a meal that didn't spike insulin, like lower carb, higher fat, same protein across the two. And I think that is relevant in light of another study that was published, finding that if someone spikes their insulin, they're much hungrier, much sooner. And part of that could be because the brain doesn't have a capacity to store energy. It has a very high metabolic rate, and all of its metabolic rate essentially must be met by whatever the nutrients are available in the blood, namely glucose and ketones.
Sure. And
so it's interesting that someone spikes their insulin, they lower their glucose levels, and they stop producing ketones because insulin inhibits ketogenesis. Well, then the brain is sensing, hey, we need more energy.
Right.
Little realizing that we've just socked it all away into our big fat cells, and the fat cells, and even the liver cells maybe, took all of it. And now the brain is left wondering where the rest of the energy is. And thus, in the absence of energy availability, it stimulates hunger and wants the person to eat again sooner. I really wanted to have a ratio of 1-to-1 protein to fat to mimic what you get in fatty beef or in an egg, because that is the ratio that was tested in humans to find the most anabolic effect at the muscle.
Interesting. Okay.
So that was the ratio of the fat to protein 1-to-1 by mass. And then I also wanted to do what no one else had done, which is have this full spectrum of fats. I wanted the short chain fats, I wanted medium chain fats, and long chain fats. And the average human diet has plenty of long chain.
Right.
The average ketogenic diet is going to have more medium chain, and we won't really have any short chain. And we make short chain fats in our bacteria, in our stomachs, in our intestines. But also the short chain fats are a fuel for the bacteria as well, not only being a fuel for us. So we were able to put the oils like the grass-fed ghee or the coconut oil or the olive oil onto a matrix like a protein carrier, but we used a resistant maltodextrin that the body doesn't digest. It doesn't break down into glucose, but it's a prebiotic fiber for the gut bacteria. So they can eat it, and then they can produce short chain fats themselves as their byproduct from eating that all it is a soluble fiber. So nevertheless, the name of the company is Health Code, HLTH. Anyone who wants to learn more can just go to a website called gethealth.com to learn more about the shake. And I put blog posts on there with some collaborators every week. For those who are a little time pressed, it's just an easy way to, get a good low carb meal.
Okay. So one, it's low carb and it has all the fats in. I think it has a lot of nutrition too. So it's not just like a protein shake, right? It's not just for proteins, but it's a
meal replacement. I know people who are using the shake for an emergency food storage.
Oh, okay.
Because it's shelf-stable for 2 years, and all you need is water. And as the economic variables are getting less predictable, I actually think there's something to that. And so I just had someone the other day ask me about this. Could they live on it? Mm-hmm. And my answer would be no, because one thing that stands out to me is that it doesn't have heme iron, and that's kind of what you have to get to prevent becoming iron deficient and developing an anemia. Someone drinking the shake 2 times a day would be a way to rapidly lose weight, because you're not spiking your insulin, and 2, it's going to be relatively low calorie. It's 800 to 1,000 calories, which is really low. And that there's always a risk to losing too much weight too quickly. Are they going to rebound back? But I would say that would be the only reason to do that. But then make sure that you kind of slowly come out of that rapid weight loss period, where more often than not, it's 1 to 2 shakes a day, maybe 1 shake a day, and then it's a real meal for dinner.